At my birthday party, my granddaughter whispered to me, "Grandfather, my parents not just watching you, they're planning something much bigger after tonight." I didn't react. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I paid attention. And what I uncovered over the next few hours changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. That night, I made a decision. I walked away quietly, but what I set in motion next. Everyone in that house will live to regret it. The fact that you're here means something to me. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? Let's make this feel like a room we're all in together. One note before we continue: this story contains fictional elements crafted for educational depth. Characters and locations are invented. The message behind them is one worth holding on to. The autumn leaves had turned the color of old rust by the time I pulled into my driveway on Camberley Street. The October sky had faded to that particular shade of steel gray. I had come to associate with the first week of fall the kind of light that made everything look slightly older than it was. I did not stop at Marcus's neighborhood on the way home, though I always drove past it. I observed the colonial house with its manicured lawn, the new silver car in the driveway, the kind of car a man buys when he needs other people to believe his life is under control. I noted everything. I said nothing. Some observations are better kept as silence. I returned home at precisely 6:30 in the evening, the same time I had been returning every weekday since Eleanor passed 6 years ago. The walk had become ritual, and ritual had become structure, and structure was the only thing keeping a man like me from drowning in the quiet of an empty house. I filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and stood in my modest Cambridge kitchen, while the water worked itself toward boiling. The house was sparse but organized. A single framed photograph on the living room bookshelf, Eleanor at 52, laughing at something off camera caught in a moment she never knew was being preserved. Everything else in this house was functional. That photograph was the only thing in it that mattered. By 7:45, I had moved to the study and opened the encrypted laptop kept in a false-bottomed drawer beneath faculty committee reports that no one had ever asked to read. The screen cast pale blue across the walls, and I reviewed the numbers I had been reviewing in one form or another for several years. 12 active patents. Combined annual royalties, $400,000. The three largest U.S. patent 8234567, U.S. patent 9123456, and U.S. patent 10567890 generated $280,000 of that total. All three were scheduled to expire on January 18th of next year, entering public domain. I had decided, 2 months ago, not to renew them. Eleanor and I had spoken about this years before she passed. She had known long before the paperwork required it that I would eventually let them go. She made me say it aloud twice. The second file, SynthMat Corporation. I had seeded the materials technology startup in 2008 with $200,000 under a holding structure that carried no public trace of my name. My equity, 22%. IPO scheduled for June of next year. Conservative valuation, $80 million. My stake at offering approximately $17.6 million. Marcus had never been told. I considered telling him once when he was still the kind of man who might have responded with something other than a calculation. That moment had passed some time ago. The third file was the trust. 6 months earlier, I had established an irrevocable instrument naming Sarah Winters as sole beneficiary. She was my granddaughter in every sense that mattered. I had been part of raising her since she was 4 after her biological parents exited her life permanently. The trust held $300,000 in patent royalties, structured so that no legal mechanism, no court order, no family member could access or alter it. Only Sarah. Upon turning 21. The documentation was precise. The instrument was sealed. I was reviewing these figures when the email arrived at 8:15. It came from my accounting firm, a man named Gerald Whitfield, Careful by nature, conservative by profession. Subject line, urgent, unusual inquiry pattern. I read it twice before I moved. Richard, I've identified unusually specific inquiries into your financial architecture over the past 4 weeks. The questions are targeted. Asset structure, patent ownership chains, trust instrument filings. Someone with legal training is investigating you. The pattern is consistent with preliminary conservatorship research. I set the laptop down and sat in the particular stillness that follows unexpected confirmation. I was not surprised. I was, if anything, relieved. Uncertainty is the one condition I genuinely cannot manage. This was no longer uncertainty. At 8:45, I opened the center drawer of my desk and removed the pen. It had been issued by MIT's Laboratory Administration in 1998, one of 12 produced for a classified materials research project involving ink compounds designed to degrade completely within a controlled timeframe. The formula was never commercialized. Most people who knew about it assumed the pens had been destroyed when the project concluded. I had retained mine by the simple expedient of never returning it. The ink writes in standard blue. It disappears without chemical residue after 48 hours at room temperature. No ultraviolet trace, no paper compression. Nothing a standard forensic examination would flag as anything other than a blank page. I held it beneath the desk lamp. It looked like any pen a retired professor might keep beside a stack of unmarked papers. That was the point. I placed it back in the drawer and locked it. Then I looked at Eleanor's photograph, visible through the study doorway from where I sat. I had arranged the furniture years ago specifically so I could see her from that chair. "They're coming," I said quietly. She never responded, of course. But 6 years of this particular solitude had taught me that speaking aloud to her was less about communication and more about accountability. I needed a witness, even one rendered permanent on photographic paper. At 9 o'clock, I called Margaret Sullivan. She answered on the first ring. "Richard," she said. "It's late. I need you to activate the contingency plan," I told her. "Everything. Tomorrow morning." A brief silence. Margaret had been my attorney for 20 years, precise measured not given to dramatic reactions. The pause lasted long enough to confirm she understood exactly what those words meant. "The full contingency?" she asked. "All of it," I said. "As quickly as legally possible." Another pause. Then, "Richard, is this about Marcus?" "It's about everything that matters," I said. "I'll explain once you have the framework in place." "I'll begin at 7, she said, and the line went quiet. I remained in the study until well past 1 in the morning, not reviewing files, not moving, simply existing in the interval between who I had been and who the coming months were going to require me to become. 68 years old. A forgotten academic in a modest house in Cambridge. Unremarkable to everyone who drove past. That was the version they had been counting on. I had been counting on them counting on it. I turned off the light, locked the study, and walked past Eleanor's photograph without stopping. 110 days remained before the patents expired. Whatever was coming would arrive long before that. I intended to be ready. The supermarket cake sat in its plastic clamshell at the center of the dining room table, the discount sticker still fixed to the base. 40% off printed in red on yellow. Nobody had removed it. I noticed within the first 30 seconds of walking through Marcus's door, because I notice everything and because in a household managed by someone as deliberate as Tiffany, nothing is ever an oversight. Leaving that sticker in place was a choice. I filed it accordingly. I arrived at the Colonial House on Whitmore Drive at exactly 6 o'clock Saturday evening, not a minute early, not a minute late. I had driven the same route I always drove, past the gas station on Route 16, past the maples that had gone fully orange since last week. The neighborhood performed its usual version of prosperity manicured lawn, freshly edged curb, the new silver car in the driveway that cost more than my son could actually afford. Marcus met me at the door. "Good to see you, Dad." The hug lasted 1.5 seconds. I counted because I always count. Most of the guests tonight are business contacts, investors, firm partners. You don't need to deal with all of that. Head back to the kitchen. Tiffany could use some company. What he said was, you don't have to bother with these people. What he meant was, these people shouldn't have to bother with you. Of course, I said, and walked toward the kitchen. I was 68 years old. I held 12 active patents. I owned 22% of a company preparing for an $80 million public offering. I sat at the small kitchen table near the window and watched the evening through a doorway I had not been invited to cross. The living room had been staged for the occasion, furniture positioned for impression artwork, selected to project a specific kind of taste. The kitchen was where the household actually operated, dishes stacked at odd angles, a grocery list on the refrigerator door, a water stain spreading slowly across the ceiling tile above the vent, and the gap between what a house performs and what it truly is can tell you most of what you need to know. Tiffany moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone doing work she would never call work. "Richard," she said, not looking up from the counter. "Could you move that chair closer to the wall? We need the floor space." I moved the chair. She said nothing further for the next 40 minutes. By 6:45, dinner had concluded, and the cake appeared. Tiffany carried it herself, setting it on the table with the deliberateness of a woman who had considered every element of this moment. The clamshell was open. The discount sticker was visible to every guest within 6 feet. 2 of them glanced at it. Nobody said anything. Tiffany caught my eye across the table and arranged her expression into something resembling apology. "Oh, Richard, we barely had time to grab this. Hope you understand. Between the renovations and Timothy's track schedule, it's been completely impossible lately. You know how it gets." The words were structured as consideration. The delivery was a small public humiliation, a communication to the room that my birthday had not been worth the effort of planning properly. "It looks fine," I said. "Really." She held my gaze for one additional second before turning back to her guests. That second was the actual message. At 7:15, Tiffany was seated near the fireplace beside a woman I didn't recognize, leaning forward at the angle people use when they want a conversation to carry without appearing to project it. "Doesn't he look like he walked straight out of 1987? Her voice carried exactly as far as she intended. "I've been trying to get him to update his wardrobe for years. You know how it is with academics. Everything stops at tenure." Light laughter. The comfortable, uncommitted kind. Marcus stood at the edge of the room. He had heard it. He chose not to respond, and that silence was its own form of answer. The answer of a man who had already decided which side of a room he was on. By 7:45, Marcus had gathered a small group near the windows and was explaining cryptocurrency with the confidence of someone who had recently become informed and mistaken that for expertise. He glanced at me mid-sentence. "It's Dodina. Don't bother asking my father about any of this." He said it warmly, which made it worse. He's genuinely brilliant in his field, but modern finance isn't exactly his territory. One of the men offered a polite recovery. "Well, he built a career that speaks for itself." "Sure," Marcus said and moved on. What he needed the room to believe was simple. His father was a man of a previous era, credentialed, limited, not someone whose awareness carried weight in the present. I understood why that narrative was useful to him. Understanding it did not make it easier to sit through. Sarah found me at 8:15. She was 18 years old, and she carried a real plate of food-grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, bread, which she set in front of me without ceremony or explanation. She pulled a second stool to the counter and sat across from me while I ate. We didn't speak for several minutes. We didn't need to. There are people in a life who understand that presence is its own language. Eleanor had possessed that quality. Sarah had inherited it through years of proximity to someone who lived it. "Thank you for coming, grandfather," she said quietly when I set down my fork. "Thank you for remembering I was here," I replied. She looked at me the particular way she sometimes did, processing more than she would say, then nodded once and returned to the living room without rushing it. At 8:45, I moved through the hallway toward the front door. Marcus stood near the coat closet phone, to his ear voice low and controlled. "The attorney appointment is next week," he was saying. "We need to move quickly before the old man understands what's happening." He looked up, saw me. The call ended. Neither of us acknowledged what had just occurred. 3 seconds passed in the hallway before he turned and walked back to his guests. I left at 9 o'clock. The goodbye hug lasted 1.1 seconds. Tiffany waved from across the room. Sarah walked me to the door without being asked. At the threshold, she leaned close and kept her voice below the noise of the room. "Grandfather, they're not just watching you. Whatever they're planning tonight wasn't the end of it. It's bigger than that. I need to show you something soon." I looked at her. I nodded once. I walked to my car. On the drive back through Cambridge, past the lit buildings of MIT, past the materials science laboratory, where I had spent the better part of 4 decades, I thought about something Eleanor had said during Tiffany's first visit to our house years ago. She had watched the younger woman move through the living room and said afterward quietly, "She watches you the way a person watches something they intend to eventually collect." I had told Eleanor she was being unfair. Eleanor was never unfair. She was simply earlier than the rest of us. The front door closed behind me at 10:12 in the evening, and the version of myself I had maintained for the past 4 hours dissolved like a held breath finally released. No more careful stillness. No more measured responses. No more performing the role of a man who does not understand what is happening around him. I walked directly past the study, past Eleanor's photograph on the bookshelf, and into the room that most people in my life assumed was a guest bedroom. The door had a standard lock on the outside. On the inside, it had something more substantial. I engaged both, switched on the desk lamp rather than the overhead light, and sat down in the chair where I had spent more honest hours in the past 6 years than anywhere else on Earth. The monitors came to life. The primary screen displayed my patent portfolio, the same structure I had reviewed 4 days earlier, though the urgency of it now carried different weight. 3 central patents, generating a combined $280,000 annually, all expiring on January 18th of next year. 9 additional patents producing 120,000 more. Numbers I had memorized long ago, not because I needed to, but because precision is how I manage fear. I said it aloud into the quiet room. If I don't renew the 3 main patents, they enter public domain. No recovery, no reversal. Anyone holding legal authority over my assets gets nothing from them. I had made that decision 2 months ago. Eleanor had known it was coming. We had spoken of it years before she died, in the way you speak of things you intend to eventually do. Tonight, after sitting in Marcus's kitchen and watching Tiffany's performance and hearing my son's voice drop to that particular low register on the phone, before the old man understands what's happening, the decision had stopped being philosophical. It had become operational. The second screen showed SynthMat Corporation's current projections. 22% equity IPO scheduled for June, conservative valuation, placing my stake at $17.6 million, a number that existed in no public record connected to my name. Marcus had spent his adult life calculating what I was worth. He had never been close. The third screen displayed the irrevocable trust instrument I had established in April 6 months ago. When the signs of what Marcus and Tiffany were planning had become something I could no longer frame as coincidence. Sarah Winter's sole beneficiary. $300,000 in initial funding, with all future royalties from the 9 remaining patents flowing in until she reached 21. The trustee was a corporate firm with no family connection, no personal loyalty, no mechanism by which any court order or power of attorney could redirect its operation. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the wall, not the one in the living room, but the second one taken 15 years ago before the diagnosis. She was laughing at something I had said that I no longer remembered. I had kept this one in the laboratory because I wanted her in the room where I actually worked. I protected her before I fully understood that I needed to, I said. The room did not answer. It never did. But the act of saying it mattered. At 11:45, I opened the email from Gerald Whitfield again. The accounting firm message I had first read 4 days ago before the birthday party had confirmed everything the message had suggested. Someone with legal training had been submitting targeted inquiries about my financial structure. The questions Whitfield had recorded were not general. They were specific in the way that only conservatorship research produced liquid asset levels, real property holdings, trust instrument filings, corporate equity positions. Someone was mapping what I owned, preparing to argue that I was no longer competent to manage it. I opened a folder I had created in August 8 weeks ago, when the first small signs had appeared, and I had begun taking them seriously rather than generously. The folder was labeled Contingency, Protocol, Conservatorship, Scenario. Inside, it was a detailed operational timeline, month by month, mechanism by mechanism, every legal tool available to a private citizen, protecting his own assets within the full boundaries of American law. I had first sketched the outline of it years earlier, sitting beside Eleanor's hospital bed on nights when she was asleep, and I had nothing to do but think. She had woken once and found me at the laptop. She had asked what I was working on. I had told her. She had said, "Good. You finally understand what needs to be true." In August, I had returned to those notes and built them into something operational. At 12:30 in the morning, I picked up the phone and called Margaret Sullivan. She answered before the second ring. "Richard," she said. "I've been waiting. The contingency protocol," I told her. "All of it. I need it activated now, not tomorrow, not by the end of the week. Now." A brief pause. "This is a significant step," she said carefully. "Are you certain this is the moment?" "I heard Marcus on the phone tonight," I said. "He's already in motion. An attorney appointment next week. I need to be ahead of him not responding to him." Silence on the line. Margaret Sullivan had been practicing law for 31 years. She understood the difference between caution and delay. "I'll need 48 hours of continuous work," she said. "I have the contacts. I know the structure. I'll begin tonight." "Thank you," I said. "That's everything I needed to hear." I set the phone down and remained at the desk. The lab was quiet except for the low hum of the climate control system, maintaining the servers at their required temperature. Outside, Cambridge had gone dark, and still in the way it only did past midnight on a weekend. I opened a new encrypted document and began writing not the emotional processing of a man working through grief or anger, but the operational notes of a person who had decided to respond to a problem with the same tools he had used to build his career, precision patience, and the kind of strategic thinking that does not require the other party's awareness to function. I did not frame what I was doing as revenge. That was not an accurate word for it. I was creating conditions, setting the stage for a sequence of events in which the people planning against me would make every critical decision themselves, without understanding that each choice was being documented, that each step was narrowing their options rather than expanding them, that the outcome had already been structurally determined long before they believed the process had begun. At 2:45 in the morning, I created a final document on the encrypted drive. I gave it a name. I wrote 4 words inside it that I would return to many times in the months ahead. They will expose themselves. I closed the laptop, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the dark for a long time. Not from exhaustion, but from the particular stillness that follows a decision made completely, without remaining doubt. The trap was not something I was setting. It was something they were building one choice at a time in a house across town where the lights had long since gone out. The rain arrived before Sarah did a quiet, steady October rain that settled over Cambridge without announcement. I had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee I hadn't particularly wanted, when I heard her key in the lock at 8 o'clock. She had a key. Eleanor had given it to her years ago, and I had never asked for it back because there had never been a reason to. Sarah came through the door carrying 2 coffees from the place on Waverly Street and a laptop bag over one shoulder. She was wearing yesterday's clothes. Her hands were steady. Her eyes carried the particular weight of someone who has been holding a secret, alone for longer than was comfortable. She set the coffees on the table, opened the laptop without ceremony, and looked at me directly. "I need to show you something, grandfather. Not a request. A statement, the voice of someone who had been carrying evidence for months and had finally decided it was time to transfer the weight." I sat down across from her and said nothing. I had learned over decades of working with graduate students that the most important thing you can do when someone is about to tell you something difficult is to make the room feel safe enough for them to finish. "I started documenting in April," Sarah said. She turned the laptop toward me. A spreadsheet filled the screen, dates in the left column, descriptions in the center, file references on the right. 6 months of entries organized with a precision I recognized immediately as her own native habit of mind. That was when Mom and Dad first mentioned the residential facility on 4th Street. They were discussing costs and timelines. The way they talked about it wasn't concern, grandfather. It was logistics. She met my eyes. I didn't trust their reasons. At 8:30, she opened an audio file. The recording was dated April 15th. The voices were unmistakable kitchen acoustics late at night, a house that believed it was alone. Tiffany's voice came first. "Once he's declared incompetent, we file for conservatorship. The patents, the house, everything transfers. It's straightforward if we establish the medical documentation correctly." Marcus quieter. "He has a lawyer. It won't be simple." Tiffany without hesitation. "His lawyer is older. He'll retire eventually, and by then the accounts will already be frozen. Once the money is secure, everything else follows." Sarah paused the recording. I sat with what I had just heard. Not because it surprised me. It confirmed what the accounting firm's email had already suggested, but because hearing your son's voice arrange your disappearance in practical terms requires a moment of its own. "I have 11 hours of recordings," Sarah said. 63 conversations. Every significant decision they made is documented. She moved through the evidence methodically, bank statements. She had photographed property records pulled from public filings, deposit patterns showing money arriving in her parents' accounts from sources that didn't match their declared income. The analysis was not improvisation. It was structured research conducted over 6 months and stored with care. "Someone has been supplementing their finances," she said. "Regular deposits, amounts calculated just under federal reporting thresholds each time. I traced some of it, but hit walls I couldn't pass without legal access. The pattern is clear, though they're being funded while they're investigating you." At 9:15, she opened photographs of documents. "These are authorization forms Dad has been having Timothy sign. They were mixed in with routine family paperwork, consent forms, standard releases, things a 15-year-old doesn't read carefully. But these 3 aren't routine. When filed, they create a legal pathway for Dad to access accounts held in Timothy's name." She paused. "Timothy has no idea what he signed. Dad is using his own son as a financial instrument." She looked at me steadily. "The accounts connect back to yours, grandfather. It's a layering strategy, building access through multiple entry points, so no single transaction appears significant." I set down my coffee. The room held only the sound of rain against the kitchen window and the soft hum of the laptop. "Grandfather." Sarah's voice changed, not softer but more deliberate, the way it became when she was saying something she had been deciding whether to say for a long time. "I need you to understand something. I didn't do this because I'm particularly smart or because I had a strategy. I did it because I love you, and because I know what it feels like to be loved properly, which is what you've always done for me. I wasn't going to let them take that from you without you knowing." For the first time in 18 hours, the composure I had maintained since the birthday party developed a crack. Not grief, recognition. Eleanor had lived in this, in the capacity for uncalculated love that existed in this young woman sitting across from me on a rainy Saturday morning. I reached across the table and held her hand. No words. Some things communicate more clearly without them. After a moment, Sarah continued, I don't know what you're planning, but I know you're planning something. I could see it in how the study was arranged last night, the documents from Margaret. Whatever you decide, you're not alone. I have independent documentation. You have backup. She opened a final file, a simple document listing 2 encrypted USB drives, storage locations, backup protocols. One copy held in her possession, one stored at the university under an account not connected to her legal name. If anything happens to either copy, the other survives. This isn't just information, grandfather. It's insurance. I stood up and pulled her into an embrace. Over her shoulder through the kitchen window, the October rain moved through the garden in quiet, steady sheets. Eleanor had always said that the people worth keeping were the ones who showed up before you knew you needed them. Sarah had shown up 6 months before. I understood that I did. When she finally stepped back and began closing her laptop, I walked to the counter and made one phone call. Margaret answered on the first ring. Richard. We have independent corroboration, I told her. My granddaughter has been documenting since April. 63 recorded conversations, financial records, signed authorization forms. Whatever we build from here, we are not building it alone. A pause on the line. Then, that changes the architecture considerably. I know, I said. Proceed accordingly. I set the phone down and stood at the kitchen window watching the rain. 2 independent investigations. 2 people who had, without coordinating, arrived at the same conclusion through different paths. Sarah had done in 6 months what I had spent years preparing to do. She had simply loved someone enough to act before she was asked. The morning light shifted behind the clouds. Somewhere across Cambridge, in a colonial house with a manicured lawn, a plan was being assembled by people who did not know they were already surrounded by the evidence of their own intentions. Marcus arrived at my house on the afternoon of October 14th, carrying a manila envelope and the particular manner of a man executing a plan he believed was already complete. He was more focused than he had been at the birthday party, less performance, more precision. Whatever hesitation he might have once had about this moment had been resolved somewhere between then and now. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, set the envelope in front of me, and slid out a document that ran to 11 pages. It's a standard health insurance upgrade, he said. Say long-term care provisions, emergency coverage extensions. The kind of thing you should have had updated years ago, honestly. I need you to sign it, Dad, for everyone's peace of mind. I did not respond to the words. I responded to the architecture behind them. The document looked legitimate. At surface-level health insurance language filled the first 6 pages with the dense, unremarkable density of genuine policy documentation. But on page 7, buried in a subsection titled Medical and Financial Coordination Provisions, was language granting Marcus comprehensive legal authority over my financial accounts, property holdings, and asset decisions. Margaret had obtained a copy of this document 3 days ago through her network. I had been expecting this visit since Tuesday. I picked up the pages and made a show of reading slowly, squinting slightly at the smaller print. Where do I sign? I asked. Marcus pointed. Page 7. That line there. That's the only one that matters. I reached for the ceramic cup of pens on the counter, the Bic I used for grocery lists and everyday notes. Then I paused. Actually, let me use this one. I opened the desk drawer and retrieved the MIT pen, the one I had placed there 10 days ago, the one that wrote in standard blue and left no trace of itself after 48 hours at room temperature. I turned it once in my fingers. A colleague gave it to me years ago. Makes me feel like I'm still part of the university when I use it. Marcus did not question this. Why would he? It was just a pen. I read page 7's critical sentence aloud, a technique I had developed over decades of reviewing contracts with students who needed to understand what they were agreeing to. Satya, this provision grants you authority to manage my financial accounts and property holdings. Marcus shifted in his chair. It's procedural, needed for emergency medical situations, so decisions can be made quickly if you're incapacitated. I nodded slowly. I signed. The ink appeared on the page, dark, clean, and entirely convincing. Marcus pulled the document toward himself immediately and examined the signature. He checked it twice. It was clear, legible, and exactly what he had come here to get. He slid everything back into the envelope and stood up. Thank you, Dad. This is genuinely helpful. He was out the door within 5 minutes. He did not look back. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single line in the margin of the notepad I kept by the fruit bowl, October 14th, 2:25 p.m. Signature active for exactly 48 hours. Then I called Margaret. Phase 1 is complete, I told her. The document is now in his possession. We'll see when he moves. I'll monitor through my contacts at his firm, she said. My estimate is he submits it Monday morning. She was right. At 10:15 on Monday morning, 47 hours and 50 minutes, after Marcus had watched me sign, his attorney submitted the document to the appropriate office for processing. Margaret received the call at 1:30 in the afternoon. He tried to file it, she said when she called me. The signature was completely gone, not faded gone. His attorney held the page up to the window to check for impressions. Nothing. There's now a notation in the file document submitted with absent signature. October 16th requires resubmission. His attorney is apparently not answering his calls. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the kitchen shelf. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it always did this time of year. The first trap worked, I said quietly, to her rather than to Margaret. He'll think the pen malfunctioned. He'll think he made an error somewhere. He won't understand that I was 3 steps ahead of him before he walked through my door. Richard, Margaret said, what do you want to do next? I had already decided. I had decided the night Marcus left my kitchen with his envelope and his certainty. Activate the debt acquisition, I told her. Prometheus Capital moves now. Begin with Marcus's gambling accounts. Sarah's documentation identifies 4 separate creditors. Acquire the outstanding balances. I want it completed before he stops being confused about the signature and starts thinking clearly again. A pause on the line. This moves us from defense to offense, Margaret said carefully. You understand that? Completely, I said. He chose his path when he walked into my kitchen with that document. I'm choosing mine. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll begin the transfer process tonight. You'll want to be unreachable for the next 72 hours. Let the paperwork do the work. I agreed and ended the call. That evening, I sat in the laboratory while the first phase of the response I had been planning since August began moving through the financial infrastructure I had constructed for exactly this purpose. I was not angry. Anger distorts judgment, and my judgment was the only reliable tool I had in this. I was simply responding to a provocation with precision, matching the methodology of someone who had spent months preparing against me with the methodology of someone who had spent years preparing for them. Marcus had invested 6 hours in constructing that document. He had invested 2 minutes in submitting it. He now had 11 pages of worthless paper and an attorney who was avoiding his phone calls. I had invested 12 months. The mathematics were straightforward. It was early December, 3 weeks after Prometheus Capital had begun operating, when something occurred to me that I should have understood 15 years earlier. I had been reviewing Sarah's financial documentation, cross-referencing deposit patterns against publicly available court records, when a name appeared in one of the corporate filings she had photographed. Not Marcus's name, not the name of his attorney. A name I had not seen in over a decade attached to a holding company that appeared in the layered structure Sarah had partially traced. Mitchell Financial Consulting, LLC, established 2010, registered in Delaware. Mitchell, Tiffany's maiden name. I opened the MIT alumni database at 9:15 that evening and typed the name with the particular steadiness of a man who already suspects what he is about to find. The record appeared in 11 seconds. Tiffany Ann Mitchell, graduate student, Department of Materials Science, enrolled September 2008. Thesis submitted April 2009. Thesis title: Thermal Stability of Polymer Composite Materials with Advanced Microstructure. Status: Rejected Academic Misconduct Investigation. Investigating faculty Dr. Richard Grayson, Dissertation Committee Chair. Outcome: student dismissed from program, degree denied. I read it twice. Then I sat back in my chair and did not move for a long time. The timeline assembled itself with the geometric clarity that data always produces when the right variables are finally present. Tiffany dismissed from MIT, May 2009. Tiffany married Marcus, August 2011. 2 years and 3 months between the destruction of her academic career and her legal entry into my family. I had presided over the committee that ended her future in materials science. I had signed the report. I had sat across from her in my office on a Thursday afternoon in April and explained, as clearly and as fairly as I was capable of, why the committee had no choice. The memory arrived fully formed. She had been 26 years old, sitting in the chair across from my desk, hands folded on her lap with a stillness that I had attributed at the time to composure. I didn't know it was wrong, she had said. I didn't understand that what I did constituted plagiarism. 40% of your thesis matched word for word with a paper published in 2006. I had told her. That's not a citation error. That's not a misunderstanding of academic convention. That's intellectual theft. Please. Her voice had not broken, which I remember noting. I'll rewrite it. I'll start the entire project again from the beginning. This is my entire future. The committee is required to follow established procedure, I had said. I'm obligated to report this. You'll have the opportunity to respond formally, but the evidence is conclusive. The meeting had lasted 45 minutes. It had ended her academic career in materials science permanently. She had left my office without looking back, which I had also noted at the time as unusual. She had not cried, she had calculated. I understood, sitting in my laboratory 15 years later, that I had been looking at this person across a dinner table for over a decade without knowing who she was, because I had known her as a last name in a file, and she had presented herself to Marcus under circumstances that gave me no reason to make the connection. Over a career of 38 years at MIT, I had advised hundreds of graduate students. The face across my dinner table had belonged to Marcus's girlfriend, then Marcus's wife. The face in my academic memory had belonged to a misconduct file I had closed in 2009 and had not thought about since. Eleanor had thought about it, though. Not by name, she hadn't known the name, but she had known something. The memory of that first dinner arrived with the particular sharpness of things you have suppressed, because accepting them is inconvenient. That woman, Eleanor had said afterward when we were alone in the kitchen. She's been watching you all evening. Why? I don't know her, I had said. She's just Marcus's girlfriend. Exactly. Eleanor had set down the dish she was drying and looked at me directly. She's no one to you. Yet she watches you the way a person watches someone who owes them something. Eleanor, you're being paranoid. I'm observing, she had said, with the particular patience she reserved for moments when I was being deliberately obtuse. "That woman is carrying something toward you. I can see it in the way she holds herself when you speak." I had dismissed it. I had attributed it to Eleanor's general wariness about Marcus's relationships, to the protective instinct of a mother who felt her son had chosen unwisely. I had been wrong in a way that had cost us years. Eleanor had never been paranoid. She had simply been precise in ways that did not require data. I opened the scholarship fund document I had been drafting for 6 months, the Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund, designated for materials science students, demonstrating both academic promise and financial hardship, funded at $3 million from my personal assets. I had begun drafting it before I understood who Tiffany was. Now I understood exactly why it needed to exist. Tiffany had been destroyed by her own failure by a choice she made in 2009 that I had been required to report and document and act upon according to my obligations as a faculty member. She had then spent 15 years constructing an architecture of revenge so patient and so precise that it had taken me this long to see the foundation of it. The scholarship was not a response to Tiffany. It was a statement about what I chose to build, rather than what she had chosen to destroy. She had wanted to erase my legacy by seizing my assets. I would make my legacy impossible to erase by investing it in people she could never reach. At 11 o'clock, I called Margaret. "When I now understand the full scope of Tiffany's motivation," I told her. "This was never purely about money. It's been a 15-year revenge strategy. She married Marcus to gain access to me. Every financial move she's made has been designed to arrive at a specific destination, my complete erasure." A pause on the line. "Does that change the legal strategy?" Margaret asked. "It sharpens it," I said. "We're not responding to opportunistic fraud. We're responding to premeditated long-form conspiracy. The documentation requirements are different. The evidentiary standard is higher. I need everything we have to be watertight." "Understood," Margaret said. "I'll adjust the framework." I set the phone down and looked at Eleanor's photograph for a long time in the quiet of the laboratory. She had seen Tiffany clearly from the first evening. She had told me what she saw. I had called her paranoid, which was the single most incorrect thing I had said to her in 38 years of marriage. "You were right," I said to the photograph. "About all of it. I'm sorry it took me this long to catch up." The monitors hummed around me. Outside, December had settled over Cambridge with the particular cold that meant the year was turning toward its conclusion. Somewhere in the city, a woman who had spent 15 years building toward this winter was about to discover that the architecture she had constructed was going to collapse in a direction she had not predicted. The garden in November had a particular quality of stillness that I had come to rely on, everything stripped back to essentials, the bare bones of what the growing season had built. Waiting for the cold to finish what the autumn had started, I was working along the back border at 7:30 in the morning, cutting back the perennials that Eleanor and I had planted together in what felt like a different life when Robert Calloway appeared on the other side of the fence. Robert had lived next door for 5 years. He was 71 years old, widowed, retired, and kept his property with the methodical care of a man who needed structure to fill his days. We had exchanged perhaps 200 conversations across that fence line over 5 years, whether local politics, the particular challenges of maintaining a Cambridge garden through unpredictable winters. He had never given me reason to think he was anything other than what he appeared to be. This morning, something in his bearing was different, more deliberate, more focused. He was watering a dormant rose bush that didn't need watering. "Richard," he said, without looking up from what he was doing. "Hypothetically speaking, if someone moved money through 4 separate accounts over a 3-day period, each transfer calibrated to land just below the federal reporting threshold, what would you say their objective was?" I set down my pruning shears. I did not answer immediately because the question was not hypothetical, and we both understood that. "Structuring," I said. avoiding mandatory disclosure to federal regulators. Robert nodded as though I had confirmed something he'd already decided. That's what I thought too. He moved the hose to the next plant. I spent 30 years at the FBI doing essentially one thing: following money. The patterns it makes when people move it carefully. The structures they build to hide where it's going. He paused. I've noticed some interesting patterns lately in the financial activity connected to certain addresses in this neighborhood. He turned then and looked at me directly across the fence line. I know your son has been investigating your financial structure, he said. I know someone retained a forensic accountant. I know there's a Delaware LLC moving money in a way that suggests protective intent rather than predatory intent. And I'm about 90% certain I know who established that LLC, and 100% certain why. I held his gaze without responding. I'm not here to expose anything, Robert said. I'm here because I want you to know that whatever you're building, you're not operating invisibly. The right people can see it, and the wrong people, a slight pause, are looking in the wrong direction. I picked up my pruning shears, considered them for a moment, and set them down again. Robert, I'm not going to confirm or deny the specifics of what you're describing, but I need to understand something. Why does this concern you? You've been my neighbor for 5 years. Why now? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, I put people in federal prison for 3 decades. Corrupt officials, money launderers, financial predators. I was good at it. And somewhere around year 27, I started noticing something I hadn't wanted to notice. The system kept producing them. I'd remove 1 and 2 more would appear. Because I was treating symptoms. I was never getting to the cause. He moved the hose again. So I retired. And I've spent 5 years trying to answer a different question. When a person with resources and intelligence is targeted by someone operating in bad faith, does the defense corrupt the defender? Or is there a way to respond that doesn't require becoming what you're fighting against? He looked at me again. I've been watching you for several months. Richard, I think you're my answer. Your answer to what? Whether it's possible to defend yourself precisely legally and with full documentation without losing the thing you're trying to protect in the process. He almost smiled. The jury is still out, but the methodology so far is sound. I extended my hand across the fence. Robert took it. If you need forensic documentation of financial crimes, he said, I have 30 years of methodology and none of the jurisdictional restrictions that limited me when I was active. I've been building a picture from publicly available records and observable patterns for the past 8 weeks. 43 pages so far. By the time anyone needs it in a courtroom, it will be airtight. I'll need time to consider the implications, I said. Take it. I'm not going anywhere. He released my hand and took a step back. One more thing. Your granddaughter, the young woman who visits. Is she conducting her own investigation independently? I said nothing. I simply looked at him. Robert nodded, once satisfied. Good. Independent verification from a separate source is the most important evidentiary principle there is. 3 independent investigators, 3 separate methodologies, 3 chains of documentation that can't be challenged as coordinated. He picked up his hose. That's how cases become unassailable. He walked back toward his house without ceremony, the way a man walks when he has said exactly what he came to say, and considers the conversation complete. I remained at the fence line for a while, looking at the bare garden. Eleanor had told me once during the early years of our marriage, when I was still learning the difference between strategy and stubbornness, that the strongest position was never the one you built alone. I had interpreted that as an emotional observation at the time. I understood now that she had been describing architecture, 3 independent lines of approach, converging on the same point from angles that Marcus and Tiffany could not simultaneously defend against. I went back to work on the garden and found that the stillness of the November morning felt considerably less solitary than it had an hour ago. The call from Margaret came on the morning of November 15th, 3 days before the conversation with Robert Calloway in the garden. Prometheus Capital LLC has been formally registered in Delaware, she said. Licensed for debt collection activity in the relevant jurisdictions. Operational bank accounts, a registered address in Wilmington. To anyone examining it from the outside, it appears entirely legitimate because it is entirely legitimate. Begin the acquisitions, I told her. Start with the highest interest accounts. I want maximum pressure but nothing that creates legal exposure. Everything by the book. Over the following 2 weeks, Prometheus Capital, operating through legitimate debt broker intermediaries, acquired Marcus's outstanding obligations from their original creditors. $190,000 in gambling debts sold to Prometheus at a standard distressed debt discount by platforms that had little expectation of recovery. $80,000 in credit card balances, $50,000 from a personal consolidation service. The total acquisition cost to me was approximately $260,000. In exchange, I had become my son's primary creditor while remaining invisible to him. The demand letter went out on the morning of January 2nd, Year 2, registered mail delivery confirmation, formal legal letterhead. Margaret called me that afternoon. He received it this morning, she said. Full outstanding balance of $320,000. 10 business days to respond with payment arrangements or documentation of dispute. I said nothing for a moment. I thought about what Marcus would be experiencing at his kitchen table with that letter in his hands. Not the specifics, which I couldn't know, but the architecture of it. The shock of seeing a company name he'd never encountered. The instinct to call the creditors he thought he knew to verify, to find an explanation that fit inside his existing understanding of his situation. What happens when he starts making calls? I asked. His original creditors will confirm the transfers were legal and properly documented, Margaret said. He'll find Prometheus's registered address in Wilmington. He'll find our business line. And when he calls that number, he'll reach a professional message informing him that Prometheus Capital does not negotiate partial payment arrangements. Full balance required, or formal collection proceedings begin. The next 3 days produced exactly the pattern I had anticipated. Marcus called his bank, his creditors, his mortgage servicer. He tried to locate Prometheus Capital through every channel available to a private citizen state business registries, bar association referrals, commercial background checks. He found a properly registered Delaware LLC with a legitimate operating address and no publicly traceable ownership beyond the corporate structure. He found nothing that shouldn't be there, because nothing that shouldn't be there existed. On January 5th, Prometheus filed for a civil judgment in the appropriate jurisdiction, the procedurally correct step following non-response to a formal demand. The filing appeared in public court records. Marcus's attorney received notification through standard legal channels. The mortgage servicer received formal notice of the pending claim, which triggered a review clause in Marcus's loan agreement. Margaret called me that evening. His wife has been consulting with attorneys separately, she said. Tiffany is pushing to accelerate the conservatorship petition timeline. Originally, they were planning to file in late February. Now she's arguing for mid-January. She wants the petition active before whatever Prometheus is doing creates additional complications. I set down my coffee. She's panicking, I said. She's calculating, Margaret replied. Which in her case tends to look the same. I thought about that for a moment. Margaret was right. Tiffany didn't panic, she recalibrated. The danger was not that she would make emotional mistakes. The danger was that her recalibration would be faster than I had planned for. Fortunately, I had planned for exactly that. On the evening of January 7th, I called Robert Calloway. "The pressure is producing the acceleration I was looking for," I told him. "They're moving the timeline forward. I need your forensic documentation ready within 2 weeks. Whatever they're going to reveal, they'll reveal it in the next 30 days. Robert's voice was unhurried. "I anticipated the acceleration 3 weeks ago," he said. "My documentation is 60% complete. Give me 1 week and it will be sufficient for federal prosecution. Give me 2 and it will be airtight." "1 week," I said. Then we briefed Margaret. I called Sarah next. "How much more do you need?" I asked her. "Oh, I have enough, grandfather," she said without hesitation. "Months of material. The pattern is clear and consistent. I've been adding to it. But nothing new is changing the picture. It's just confirming what was already there." "Good," I said. "Hold everything secure. Don't share it with anyone until I tell you the timing is right." "Understood," Sarah said, and I could hear in her voice that she had been waiting for exactly this kind of directive proof that the process was moving toward something definite. I spent that evening in the laboratory reviewing the full architecture of what Prometheus Capital had accomplished. Not the money was secondary. What the demand letter had actually done was change the operational tempo. Marcus and Tiffany had been working on their timeline. Now they were working on mine, and they didn't know it. People in fear move faster than they should. Faster movement produces corners, cut decisions made on incomplete information actions, taken before the ground has been properly checked. I had not created the fear to punish Marcus. I had created it to generate exactly this condition. The condition in which people who believed they were executing a plan were actually executing a reaction. Eleanor had understood this intuitively. She had told me once that the most dangerous thing you could do to a careful person was make them feel they were running out of time. Careful people, when rushed, became careless. January was going to be very instructive. Before I tell you what Marcus found on that phone, type "stay" in the comments right now. Just that one word. It tells me you're still here, and that this story is reaching the people it's meant to reach. One thing worth noting. The story ahead blends fictional elements with its structure for educational and storytelling purposes. If this isn't the content for you, no pressure. This is a perfectly fine place to step away. I did not witness what happened in that hotel room on the night of January 12th. What I know about it, I know from Marcus, reconstructed from a phone call made at 3:47 in the morning from a parking lot near the airport, delivered in fragments between silences that told me as much as the words did. This is what he told me happened. They had been staying at a mid-range hotel near Kendall Square for 11 days. Relocated after the mortgage servicer's review triggered a payment acceleration notice that made remaining in the house untenable. Marcus's phone had been charging in the bathroom. He needed to make a call. He picked up Tiffany's phone from the nightstand, something they had done casually throughout their marriage. An ordinary domestic gesture, and the screen was still lit from whatever she had last been looking at before she stepped into the shower. He saw the name at the top of the conversation thread. He started reading. What he found was a text exchange with a man named David. Not a professional contact, not a colleague, but someone whose messages carried the familiarity of a long and private understanding. The most recent exchange had been sent 4 hours earlier. "After we have the house and the patents, I'm booking the flight. Miami is ready. You. Confirmed. 1 week after the deed transfers. The new accounts are set up. What about Timothy? Leave him with the old man. Once the money is secure, it doesn't matter who has the boy. And Marcus, he was always just access. Once the transfer's complete, he becomes a liability. We manage that then." Marcus scrolled backward through 3 months of messages. He found detailed planning flight routes, account structures, timeline arguments between Tiffany and David about when to accelerate. He found a message from October that read, "We need him to finish the signature documents. Then we disappear before he understands what happened. He had been reading for 20 minutes when Tiffany came out of the bathroom. She saw the phone in his hands. She understood immediately what he had read. She made a calculation, the same kind of calculation she always made, and chose the truth over a denial she correctly assessed he would not believe. "Geez, how long?" Marcus asked. His voice, he told me, was very controlled. "How long have you been planning to leave?" Tiffany sat down on the bed and began getting dressed, with the unhurried precision of someone who had already internalized this moment. "Since 2011, she said. "Since I married you. You were supposed to be the access point. Your father has assets you never understood how to leverage. I did it for both of us, and then when it became clear you would never be useful enough, I did it for myself. And Timothy goes with you or your father. I don't care which. He was necessary to keep you invested. That's all he was." Marcus left the room without responding. He drove to a parking lot near Logan Airport and sat in his car for 4 hours watching planes lift into the dark at intervals that felt, he told me, like punctuation marks in a sentence he was only now learning to read. At 3:47 in the morning, he called my house. I heard the phone on the third ring and made myself wait for it. There are moments that require being met deliberately rather than reflexively. "Dad," he said when I picked up. His voice was hollowed out in the particular way that happens when the structure a person has been living inside collapses all at once. "So she's been planning to disappear. She has accounts I don't know about. She's been with another man for years. She's going to leave me and Timothy and take everything she can carry." He stopped. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." I sat with that for a moment. Not with satisfaction, I want to be precise about that. What I felt was closer to the particular weight of a thing you have been preparing for and still find heavy when it arrives. "Mark said," I said. "Where are you?" He told me, "Stay there. Don't go back to the hotel tonight. Find a diner, get something warm, and wait for morning. Then come to my house. We'll talk about what comes next." A long silence on the line. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. "I've known for a while. Right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is what we do with the morning." I set the phone down and remained in my chair in the dark study for some time. I thought about Tiffany sitting on that hotel bed, dressing with complete composure, delivering the truth to her husband with the same effect she would have used to read a financial statement. 15 years of patience, and she had ended it in 4 sentences. Not because she had slipped, because she had decided the concealment was no longer worth the maintenance cost. She was already gone, in every way that mattered. The physical departure was just administration, and Marcus, my son, who had walked into my kitchen with a fraudulent document and walked out believing himself clever, had spent the night in a parking lot, learning what it felt like to be on the other side of someone else's strategy. The education was brutal. It was also, I suspected, the first honest thing that had happened to him in years. Tomorrow he would come to my house. We would have a conversation I had been preparing for since August, and whatever came out of that conversation would determine whether the next phase of this, the phase that moved beyond protection into resolution, would be built on the remains of a broken family or something that might, with time, become something else. I was not optimistic, but I was not without hope. He was at my door at 7 in the morning, still wearing the clothes from the night before. I had not slept much myself. I opened the door before he knocked. I had heard his car pull into the driveway and stood aside to let him in without ceremony. He looked like a man from whom something structural had been removed. Not broken exactly, emptied. The particular kind of empty that follows the collapse of a story you have been telling yourself for a long time. I put coffee on the table. I sat across from him. I said nothing. Marcus began talking at 7:30, slowly at first, then with the accelerating momentum of someone who has been holding weight for so long that the act of setting it down becomes its own momentum. He told me about the guardianship petition. about the plan to have me declared incompetent and the accounts frozen, about the conversations with Tiffany that he now understood had been directed by her rather than shared with him, about the gambling debts, the full scope of them, the years of accumulation, the desperation that had made him capable of walking into my kitchen with a fraudulent document and calling it insurance paperwork. He told me about the attorney he had consulted, the financial modeling they had done on what my assets were worth and how quickly they could be liquidated, the timeline they had established for filing the petition before I became aware enough of what was happening to mount a legal defense. He told me everything, every piece of it. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. I picked up my coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "See, I've known since October," I told him. "Most of it since earlier than that." I stood up and walked to the study. I came back with the folder I had been building since August, not everything in it, but enough. The forensic accounting Robert had compiled, 2 of Sarah's audio recordings, the bank transfer records showing Tiffany's money movements into accounts Marcus hadn't known existed, a copy of the guardianship petition that Margaret had obtained through her own channels weeks before Marcus believed I had any knowledge of it. I set it on the table between us and watched him read. It took him 11 minutes. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted into a territory I had not seen in my son since he was perhaps 30 years old, the expression of a person who has stopped calculating and started simply being present. "Why haven't you already destroyed me with this?" he asked. "Because destroying you was never the objective," I said. "Protecting what matters was the objective. Those are different things, even if they can sometimes look identical from a distance." He was quiet. "I have one question for you," I said. "Why should I help you? Why should I do anything other than let the legal system process your actions against me?" Marcus looked at me with eyes that had, I thought, finally decided to be honest. "Because I'm your son," he said. "And you taught me a long time ago, before I forgot, that family means showing up for people even when they don't deserve it. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for it anyway." I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the wall for a long moment. Not for guidance, exactly. More as an acknowledgement, a way of saying I see the choice in front of me, and I understand what it costs. "I will not forgive what you did," I said, finally turning back to Marcus. "Not today. Maybe not ever. But I'm going to protect you from some of the consequences, not because you've earned it, but because Timothy hasn't done anything to deserve losing both parents to this." I laid out the terms without softening them. Marcus would cooperate fully with law enforcement. He would provide whatever evidence and testimony the federal investigators required regarding Tiffany's financial crimes and the conspiracy she had been operating. He would withdraw the guardianship petition before the end of the week. In exchange, I would not press charges for the fraudulent document or the attempted account fraud charges that, given the disappearing ink signature and the documentation Margaret had compiled, would be straightforward to prosecute. He would face the gambling debts independently. He would not receive financial assistance from me beyond what I chose to provide to Timothy. And he would never again attempt to access leverage or circumvent my assets in any form. "Understood?" I asked. "Yes," Marcus said. I called Margaret Sullivan first. "Marcus is here. He's cooperating. Begin preparing for federal involvement." Then I called Robert Calloway. "I need the forensic documentation ready for law enforcement. Tiffany Mitchell Grayson federal wire fraud tax evasion criminal conspiracy. Can you have it organized by this evening?" Robert's voice was unhurried. "It's already organized," he said. "I've been waiting for this call for 3 weeks. Marcus and I spent the next hour on practical matters where he would stay. How to tell Timothy what had happened in terms a 15-year-old could absorb, what the federal cooperation process would look like, and how long it would take. The conversation was quiet, almost administrative. 2 people working through the logistics of a situation that had already been decided. At 10 o'clock, before Marcus called the FBI field office to initiate the cooperation agreement, I stopped him. "There's something I need to say," I told him. "I contributed to this. Not to Tiffany's plan that was her design and your participation. But I hid my assets from you for years. I let you believe I was something lesser than I was, and I gave you no honest picture of what you stood to inherit or receive. That silence was its own kind of failure." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, Dad. I made choices. I married someone I should have looked at more carefully. I gambled away stability I didn't have. I walked into your kitchen with forged documents. Those were my decisions." He paused. "But thank you for saying it. It's the first time in a long time you've said something to me that didn't feel like management." He picked up his phone and made the call. I sat in the kitchen and listened to my son's voice in the hallway, careful, honest, cooperative, and understood that the trap I had built since August had not been intended to catch anyone. It had been intended to create a set of conditions in which the people moving against me would be forced to reveal themselves fully, and in revealing themselves, would arrive at a moment of genuine reckoning. Marcus had arrived at his reckoning. What he did with it now was his to decide. Before I reveal the one thing that changes everything, type Prometheus in the comments. I want to know how many of you saw this coming. Most people don't. Note this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or circumstances is coincidental. The lesson it carries is worth your attention. Rebecca Walsh had been practicing federal litigation for 27 years. Margaret Sullivan had brought her in 3 weeks earlier, describing her as the person you retained when you needed someone who understood not just what the law permitted, but how to present what the law permitted in a room full of people who were about to have an unpleasant afternoon. The conference room on the 14th floor of her building overlooked the harbor. It was cold, fluorescent lit, and arranged for precision documents stacked in order of presentation. Water glasses already filled a single recorder on the table that everyone present had been informed was running. I arrived with Marcus at 1:45. Rebecca was already seated. Tiffany's attorney, a compact, careful man named Gerald Foote, who specialized in asset protection and clearly had not been fully briefed on what he was walking into, arrived at 5 minutes before 2. His client was absent, represented only through her legal proxy, which Rebecca had anticipated and arranged for in advance. At 2 o'clock exactly, Rebecca called the meeting to order. "This meeting has been convened," she said, "to establish the full factual and legal record regarding actions taken by Tiffany Mitchell Grayson and Marcus Grayson against Dr. Richard Grayson over the preceding 4 months. We are here to document the timeline, identify applicable statutes, and clarify the legal position of all parties before federal proceedings commence." Foote shifted in his chair. "What action specifically? My client has no outstanding legal matters that require—" "She will," Rebecca said, and placed the first document on the table. Prometheus Capital LLC, Certificate of Incorporation, Delaware. November 15th, Year 1. Operating license for debt collection activity in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Bank account records. Registered address in Wilmington. Foote picked up the document and read it with the careful attention of a man who was already beginning to understand that the ground beneath him was not what he had assumed. Prometheus Capital, Rebecca continued, acquired $320,000 in outstanding obligations on November 15th of last year. These obligations belonged to Marcus Grayson, specifically gambling debts, credit card balances, and an unsecured personal loan. The acquisitions were completed through legally documented transfers from the original creditors. Foote set the document down with the controlled movements of someone managing his reaction. "And the relevance of this to my client is what exactly—" "The relevance," Rebecca said, is that your client's strategy over the preceding months was premised on using those debts as financial leverage. The working theory was that Prometheus Capital represented an independent threat, an external creditor applying pressure that would force Marcus Grayson toward desperate decisions, including accelerating the conservatorship petition against his father. She paused. Your client was planning to exploit that pressure. What she did not know was who owned the pressure. She looked at me. I stood up. It was the first time I had spoken in this room, and I was aware that everyone present was watching me with varying degrees of calculation. I am Prometheus Capital, I said. I purchased my son's debts in November of last year. I did not do it to punish him. I did it because the people in this room, or at least one of them, were planning to use those debts as the financial mechanism that would allow them to strip my son of his agency and use him as a conduit to access my assets. I looked at Foote directly. Your client believed she was exploiting an external crisis. She was in fact walking into a structure I built specifically to document her intentions. The silence in the room lasted approximately 4 seconds. Foote said, "This is what is this? An entrapment operation. This violates federal—" "It violates nothing," I said. "I am a private citizen who used legal mechanisms to protect his assets from what constitutes elder financial abuse under both federal statute and Massachusetts law. Every step of what I did is documented, time-stamped, and preserved for these proceedings. I broke no laws. I bent no laws. I simply operated within them more carefully than the people working against me." Rebecca took over, laying out the timeline with the systematic efficiency that 27 years of courtroom experience produces. The fraudulent insurance document presented in October, signed with ink that vanished within 48 hours, confirmed by forensic document analysis Margaret had commissioned in November. The attempted filing at Marcus's attorney's office, the formal debt acquisition through Prometheus Capital in November, the demand letters, Tiffany's response documented through Sarah's audio recordings of pushing the conservatorship timeline forward as financial pressure intensified. The financial transfers into accounts in Tiffany's name that Marcus had not known existed, identified through Robert Calloway's forensic accounting across 51 pages of analysis. Foote was no longer asking questions. He was reading. Rebecca then placed the legal summary before him. Federal wire fraud charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Criminal conspiracy under 18 U.S.C. Section 1349. Federal tax evasion for the concealed accounts. Elder financial abuse under Massachusetts general laws. Chapter 265. Section 13, K. Marcus's cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors signed and dated January 14, 17 days earlier. Your client, Rebecca said, has 24 hours to voluntarily surrender to federal authorities. If she does not, a warrant will be issued. Based on the current evidentiary record, she is facing 5 to 7 years in federal custody plus restitution. Foote gathered his documents with the careful movements of someone who needs his hands to have something to do. He stood. He said nothing further. He walked out of the conference room and did not close the door behind him. The room was quiet. Rebecca looked at Marcus, then at me. Is there anything either of you needs clarified before I begin the formal filing process? No, I said. Rebecca nodded and began collecting her own documents. Marcus and I remained at the table for a moment, after she left the room, not speaking, not needing to. We walked out together into the late January light of downtown Boston. The harbor was visible between buildings gray and cold under a clear sky. After half a block, Marcus said, "You planned all of this from the beginning." I considered how to answer that honestly. "I planned to protect Sarah," I said. "Every other element, the debts, Prometheus. The pressure on Tiffany's timeline was landscape I had to navigate to make that protection permanent. The trap wasn't designed to catch Tiffany. It was designed to create conditions where anyone acting against me in bad faith would eventually have to reveal the full extent of what they were doing. Tiffany revealed it, because she's predictable when she's afraid, and I gave her enough to be afraid of. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, what was I in all of this? I stopped walking. I looked at my son in the January light. You were the person I hoped would wake up before it was too late, I said. It turned out I was right about that. You did. That matters more to me than anything else that happened in that room today. He nodded slowly. We walked the rest of the block without speaking, which felt for the first time in a long time like a comfortable silence rather than an avoidant one. The day after the meeting in Rebecca Walsh's conference room, I woke at 6 in the morning, made tea, reviewed the patent renewal documentation for the 9 remaining active patents, and drove to MIT to teach a 2-hour seminar on thermal conductivity in composite materials. My students asked intelligent questions. I answered them. The seminar ran 12 minutes over schedule, which I noted and apologized for at the end. I drove home through the February cold, ate dinner that Marcus had cooked badly but with visible effort, and went to bed at 10. This was February 1st. The trap had closed, the Prometheus reveal was complete, the federal machinery had been engaged, and my life looked almost identical to what it had looked like in September, before any of it had begun. Sarah found this remarkable when she came to the laboratory on the afternoon of February 3rd. She set down her bag, looked at the monitors displaying the same patent dashboards they always displayed, and said, "Grandfather, are you all right?" "I'm not certain what all right means anymore," I told her honestly. "But I'm still operational. For now, that's sufficient." She nodded and sat down. She was working on a polymer degradation analysis, her own project, something she had proposed in January, and I had agreed to supervise. The work was genuinely good. She had, at 18, a more intuitive grasp of materials behavior under stress than most of my graduate students showed in their second year. Eleanor would have found that deeply unsurprising. Robert Calloway called on the morning of February 3rd. "The federal prosecutors have reviewed my forensic documentation," he said. "All 51 pages. They've confirmed the wire fraud and criminal conspiracy charges are solid. The tax evasion component adds further exposure. She's looking at the higher end of the sentencing range, closer to 7 years than 5 based on the premeditation evidence." "Thank you, Robert," I said. "I mean that genuinely. I could not have built this without you. You could have tried," he said, "and you might have failed at the evidentiary stage. That's why I'm here, not to help you succeed, but to ensure you didn't fail at the moment when it mattered most." Marcus testified before the federal grand jury on February 6th. I did not attend. Sarah went with him not as a legal representative, but as family, which was its own kind of weight-bearing. When Marcus returned that evening, he sat at the kitchen table and gave me a thorough account, delivered with the careful precision of someone who had spent 2 hours under oath and had not deviated from the truth once. "I told them everything," he said. "The plan to have you declared incompetent, the conversations with Tiffany about the patents and the house, the financial modeling we did, the documents I brought to your kitchen, all of it." "In good," I said. "That testimony is evidence now. The system will do with it what systems do." He nodded. He looked, I thought, lighter than he had in years. Not happy, that would have been inappropriate and probably temporary, but cleaner. Like a man who has finally put down something he had been pretending was not heavy. Tiffany did not surrender voluntarily within the 24-hour window Rebecca had provided. The arrest warrant was issued on February 8th. She was taken into custody at Logan Airport on February 9th at the departure gate for a flight to Miami, traveling under her own name with 2 checked bags and a man who matched the description of the David from her phone messages. She was remanded without bail flight risk, the magistrate ruled, with documented evidence of a planned departure. Margaret called me with the news at 11:30 in the morning. "She's in custody," she said. "No bail. Trial will be scheduled." I sat with that for a moment. "All right," I said. "Thank you, Margaret." Timothy came to find me on the evening of February 10th. He was 15 years old and navigating something no 15-year-old should have to navigate. And he was doing it with more composure than I might have managed at twice his age. He stood in the kitchen doorway and asked very directly, "Is it true my mother is going to prison?" "Yes," I said. "She made choices that constitute federal crimes. The consequences are serious. That wasn't my decision. It was hers when she decided to act the way she did." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, is my dad okay? Your father is choosing to be better than his circumstances," I said. "That's a choice he makes every day now. You can make the same one. And I think you already know how." Timothy absorbed this the way young people absorb difficult truths, when they're ready to hear them fully without needing it softened. Sarah and I worked through the afternoons of the second week. The polymer analysis was progressing well. We didn't discuss Tiffany or the trial timeline or what came next. We discussed the behavior of materials under sustained thermal stress, which felt in its own way like the right conversation. On February 12th, Sarah looked up from her microscope and said, "Do you know what I find interesting? We're doing exactly the same work as before. Everything in here is identical, but everything outside has changed completely. That's the nature of deep structural change," I said. "The laboratory holds constant. The world shifts around it. We just keep working and let the shift occur." She went back to her analysis. On February 13th, a brief email arrived from Rebecca Walsh. "The legal proceedings are now in the hands of the federal prosecutors. Your role in the process is complete. The witnesses will proceed independently." I replied, "Thank you for your precision throughout this. It made the difference." Her response came within the hour. "You were an exceptional client. Most people in your position either become what they're fighting against or collapse under the weight of defending themselves. You managed neither. That's rarer than you might think." I set the phone down and went to the garden. The February earth was hard and cold, but there were signs in it a particular quality to the soil near the foundation wall where the house provided some shelter that suggested the frost was beginning to release. Eleanor and I had learned to read those signs together over many years of tending this same ground. I stood there long enough to be certain I wasn't imagining them. Marcus found me there late in the afternoon. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, decent coffee from the good machine, not the automatic one, and he handed me one without preamble. "I'm going to start looking for work," he said. "Something smaller. Somewhere I can be honest about what I've done." "That's the right choice," I said. "I know I can't undo what I tried to do," he continued. "But I'm going to try to be the person you apparently believed I could still become." I put my hand on his shoulder briefly. "Start with being the father Timothy needs," I said. "Everything else follows from that." We stood in the garden while the last of the February light faded over the bare trees, 2 people on the other side of something drinking coffee in a silence that had finally learned to be still. The federal courthouse in Boston had a particular quality of institutional permanence. Marble floors, high ceilings, the accumulated gravity of consequences, handed down across generations. I had not been inside it before. I hoped once this was finished I would not need to return. Sarah sat beside me in the public gallery. Timothy had come as well, which Marcus had asked, and I had supported on the grounds that 15 is old enough to watch your family face the truth. We sat in the 3rd row. The room was perhaps 2/3 full, reporters, law clerks, people with professional reasons to be present, and people who had simply come to observe. Federal trials carry their own particular gravity. People feel it. Marcus was called to the stand at 9 o'clock. He walked to the witness box with the measured pace of someone who has decided what they're going to say and is not looking for last-minute adjustments. He placed his hand on the Bible. He took the oath in a clear voice. No performance, no attorney's precision. Just a man who had arrived at a place where honesty was the only remaining option and had decided to embrace it rather than be dragged into it. The federal prosecutor, a careful, methodical woman named Carol Reeves, who had been built for exactly this kind of work, led Marcus through the timeline with the systematic patience of someone who already knows every answer and is simply asking so that the record will contain them. When had Marcus first been told about the plan to access his father's assets? What had his role been in the guardianship petition? When had he understood that the financial transfers were fraudulent? What did he know about the accounts in Miami? Marcus answered each question completely and without qualification. He described the gambling debts, the full scope of them, how they had accumulated, and what they had made him capable of believing was acceptable. He described the meetings with Tiffany about the petition. He described his own awareness that what they were planning was wrong. At 10:30, Reeves asked the question I had been waiting for since the proceedings began. At any point during this planning, she said, "Did you believe your father was genuinely incapacitated or incompetent?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. "No," he said. "I knew my father had full capacity. I knew he was intelligent and aware. I knew that what we were planning, freezing his accounts, placing him in a facility, seizing his assets, I knew it was wrong." He paused. "I did it anyway. Because I was desperate and because I was weak, and because I had convinced myself that desperation and weakness were sufficient justification." The courtroom held the weight of that for a beat longer than was comfortable. Tiffany's defense attorney, Gerald Foote, who had walked out of Rebecca Walsh's conference room without speaking, and had since prepared what he clearly believed was a credible cross-examination, began his challenge with the standard instruments of a case built on undermining a cooperating witness. "Isn't it true," he said, "that you're testifying today in exchange for immunity from prosecution?" "Yes," Marcus said. "But that doesn't make what I'm saying untrue. I'm testifying because it's accurate, not because I was instructed what to say." "Isn't it true that you're motivated by personal animosity toward your wife?" "I'm motivated by the legal agreement I signed, and by the fact that what I'm describing actually happened." "Tachosin, isn't it true that this entire sequence of events was orchestrated by your father? That Dr. Richard Grayson constructed the conditions you're now describing as criminal?" Marcus looked at Foote with an expression that was very close to patience. "My father didn't orchestrate my choices," he said. "He built structures to protect himself from them. Those are different things. My choices were mine. I made them over months before I understood what my father was doing." "The sequence of events happened in the order the evidence shows," my father responded. "I was the initial actor." Foote had no further productive lines and moved on to procedural challenges that Reeves dispatched with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated each one. At noon, Reeves returned with a single final question. "Do you regret your actions, Mr. Grayson?" Marcus looked toward the gallery. He found me briefly. Then he looked at the prosecutor. "What I regret not becoming the man my father raised me to be," he said. "I regret marrying someone I didn't understand because she told me what I needed to hear. I regret being the kind of man who could walk into his father's kitchen with a fraudulent document and call it an insurance form." He paused. "I regret everything." "Yes." Reeves rested. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, a tight window for a federal case. But not remarkable when the documentary evidence runs to 51 forensic pages, and the cooperating witness has just spent 3 hours contradicting nothing in it. They returned at 4:15 with guilty verdicts on 7 counts: wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, tax evasion, and 3 related charges. Tiffany showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. She had calculated, I suspect, that this outcome was possible. What she had not calculated was losing to a retired neighbor with a garden hose and a granddaughter with a university cloud account. She was remanded to custody. In the corridor during the brief recess before the jury had returned, Marcus found Sarah and me. "Thank you for being here," he said. "We're family," I said. "We show up," Sarah added without expression. "Even when we don't particularly want to." Marcus almost laughed. It was the first time I had seen him close to laughing in 4 months, and it looked like something that had been sitting in cold storage and was slowly returning to room temperature. In the car on the way home, Marcus said, "What happens to Timothy now?" "Timothy goes where he's safe," I said. "That's with us if you're prepared to be his father again, instead of whatever else you've been trying to be." Marcus looked at the highway through the windshield. "I'm prepared to try." "That's enough," I said. "That's always been enough. There is a moment I have not yet described, because it happened between the morning my son came to my house with empty hands and the afternoon the trap was formally revealed. It happened on January 18th, and I return to it now, after the trial, after the verdict, after everything, because it is the moment the entire structure became, for the first time, fully visible to me. I was in the laboratory at 9 in the morning on January 18th, reviewing Sarah's polymer analysis from the previous week, when the email arrived from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The subject line was administrative. Patent Maintenance Fee Status Update. I had received dozens of similar emails over the course of my career, and each one had carried the particular bureaucratic weight of an institution indifferent to the significance of its own communications. I opened this one and read it with the same careful attention I gave to everything the USPTO sent me. The renewal deadline for the following patents has elapsed. Pursuant to 35 U.S.C. Section 41B, the patents listed below have entered the public domain and are no longer protected under federal patent law. They may be used, manufactured, or commercialized by any party without license. Permission or royalty obligation. U.S. Patent 8.2.3.4.5.6.7, Polymer Thermal Stability. U.S. Patent 9.1.2.3.4.5.6, Advanced Graphene Composite Structures. U.S. Patent 1.05.6.7.8.9.0, Thermal Adaptive Materials. I read it twice. Then I set the laptop down and sat in the quiet of the laboratory for several minutes, looking at nothing in particular. 3 patents, the 3 most valuable in my active portfolio. Combined annual royalties $280,000. The assets that Tiffany Mitchell Grayson had spent the better part of a year studying, mapping, and positioning herself to seize, because they were, in her estimation, the most liquid, most transferable, most immediately convertible components of my financial architecture. She had spent months building access to assets that, as of 9 this morning, were worth exactly nothing to anyone. They belonged to the world now. No owner, no royalties, no mechanism by which any legal instrument, power of attorney, conservatorship, or any other could extract value from them. The mathematics of the situation had a particular quality of irony that I had not fully appreciated until I saw it written out in an email with an automated timestamp. I opened the folder from August, the month I had made the decision. The records were precise. August 30th decision reached to allow the 3 primary patents to expire without renewal. September 5th, formal cancellation of the automatic renewal authorization submitted to the patent maintenance firm. September 12th, Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund provisional structure established, funded in part by the royalties from the 9 patents I intended to keep. November 15th, Prometheus Capital activated debt acquisition commenced. January 18th, patents expired, entered public domain. Tiffany had begun her accelerated timeline in October after the disappearing ink document failed. She had intensified it in November after the Prometheus demand letter arrived. She had been operating throughout that entire period on the assumption that the primary targets of her strategy retained their value. They had not retained their value since September, when I canceled the renewal. She simply had not known. I called Margaret Sullivan at 10 o'clock. The patents expired this morning, I told her. As intended. A pause on the line. All three, she asked. All three, public domain as of today. Margaret was quiet for a moment. In the particular way she became quiet when she was working through the implications of something. Even if she had succeeded, she said slowly, even if the conservatorship had been granted, even if she had gained legal control of your assets, she would have discovered that the three patents she valued most were worthless. She would have seized 3 pieces of paper. That's correct. Shocked Richard, Margaret said. You canceled the renewals before you knew the full scope of what she was planning. You made that decision in August based on a preliminary suspicion. Yes. Which means, she continued, that even your contingency for failure was built into the original architecture. Even if everything else had gone wrong, the primary targets would have been worthless by the time anyone reached them, I said. Yes, that was the point. Another pause. Then, with the restraint of a woman who had been a lawyer for 3 decades, that's rather extraordinary. It's mathematics, I said. Applied far enough in advance. I thanked her and ended the call. The 9 remaining patents, those I had chosen to retain, the ones generating $120,000 annually, were held in the irrevocable trust established in April of last year. Sarah Winters, sole beneficiary. Independent corporate trustee. No mechanism by which any person, any court order, or any conservatorship arrangement could redirect the income or touch the principal. By the time Sarah turned 21, the trust would hold approximately $2 million in accumulated royalties. Tiffany had planned to seize the royalty streams. She would have found the 3 largest ones expired and the remaining 9 permanently beyond her reach. I stood and walked to Eleanor's photograph on the laboratory wall, the one taken 15 years ago before the diagnosis. I did not speak to it often. I had learned that the habit, when indulged too freely, became a way of avoiding the present rather than honoring the past. But on January 18th, I made an exception. I didn't let these expire to hurt her, I said. I let them expire because I decided in August that they represented a portion of my life I was prepared to surrender. The career that generated those 3 patents, the 38 years of research, the late nights, the arguments with grant committees, that chapter is complete. The 9 I kept represent what comes next. The scholarship, Sarah's trust, the work she and I are doing together in the afternoon when the students have gone home. The photograph, as always, did not respond. I sat back down and composed a brief email to the federal prosecutors. For your information, the 3 patents listed in the indictment as assets, the defendant conspired to seize US 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, US 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and US 10, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 entered public domain today, January 18th, following non-renewal in September of last year. As of this date, they carry no commercial value. This information may be relevant to sentencing discussions as evidence of the defendant's actual strategic effectiveness. The prosecutors would use it. Rebecca Walsh had already indicated that premeditation evidence and demonstrated outcome would factor into the sentencing recommendation. By 11:30, I had returned to Sarah's polymer analysis because there was work to be done, and because the work was the point. The 3 patents were gone. The value they had once represented, $280,000 a year, compounded across the remaining years of their natural life, was gone with them. That is not a small amount. I want to be honest about that because the loss is real. I did not sacrifice them lightly, and I did not sacrifice them without understanding what I was giving up. I gave them up because I had decided before any of this began that certain things matter more than their monetary equivalent. The scholarship that bears Eleanor's name will support materials science students for as long as the endowment holds. The trust for Sarah will provide her with a foundation she cannot be maneuvered away from. What I protected has a value that doesn't appear on a financial statement. What I let go was never what this was about. I saved the USPTO email into the archive folder and closed the laptop. Outside January, Cambridge was doing what January Cambridge always did, cold clear. Indifferent to the decisions of the people living in it, I went back to work. 14 months had passed since the verdict. The Materials Science Department hallway in Building 13 looked exactly as it had looked for the 38 years I had been walking through it. The same linoleum floors worn smooth at the center. The same bulletin boards layered with research announcements and fellowship applications. The same particular smell of institutional heating and old paper that I had long ago stopped noticing. I was reviewing fellowship application files at my desk on the afternoon of May 30th when I heard the knock at the open office door. Timothy stood in the doorway. He had grown 4 inches since October of the previous year, the particular growth that happens to young men between 15 and 17 with no apparent transition, as though the change occurs overnight and simply presents itself as accomplished fact. He was carrying a folder and looked the way applicants always looked, anxious and hopeful in approximately equal measure. "Hi, grandfather. Hope you don't mind." I was already on campus for the application process, and I wanted to stop by and say hi. I stood up. I was genuinely pleased, which was a simpler feeling than most of the feelings I had navigated in the preceding 14 months. "Of course not. Come in. What brings you to the university?" He sat in the chair across from my desk, the chair where I had once sat across from graduate students, and explained as clearly as I was capable of why certain choices had irreversible consequences. The chair had held better and worse conversations over the years. "I'm applying for the Summer Research Fellowship," Timothy said. He set his folder on the desk, with the careful gesture of someone who has organized it several times and is trying not to let that show. "Materials Science Program. I thought since you work here, and since you know the field, you might be willing to write a letter of recommendation." "I'd be honored," I said. I reached for the folder to look at the application materials, and there it was in the header section of the fellowship form, recipient Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund Academic Year Award. Timothy had been receiving it for 9 months. The scholarship I had established from the patent royalties held in trust the 9 patents I had chosen to keep. Channeled through the independent trustee, distributed to students in financial need with demonstrated academic promise. The scholarship that bore Eleanor's name had found its way to her step-grandson without my needing to direct it. "Yeah, Timothy," I said carefully, "do you know where the Eleanor Walsh Scholarship comes from?" He shook his head. "I got the notification last fall. I know it's a real endowment, I looked it up. But the foundation doesn't publish donor information. It's anonymous." I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the courtyard between Building 13 and Building 16. Students moved through the afternoon light on the pathways below, and I thought about Eleanor walking this same campus with me in 1987, the year we arrived in Cambridge, and she told me that MIT felt like a place that took ideas seriously as a civic obligation. "The Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund is named after your grandmother," I said. "My wife. She passed away 6 years ago. When I established the fund, I structured it specifically to support students in materials science who demonstrate both academic ability and financial need." I paused. "Students like you." The silence behind me lasted several seconds. "That's," Timothy said. "You established it." I turned back from the window. "Yes, and I've been very glad to see you received it." He was quiet in the way young people are quiet when they're processing something that changes the shape of a large portion of their recent past. I sat back down and opened my laptop, navigating to a document I had created in February when it had become clear to me that Timothy was going to apply for this fellowship. The letter of recommendation was already written, detailed, specific, built around observations I had been making since the boy was 12 years old. I turned the screen toward him and read several passages aloud. Timothy Grayson demonstrates the capacity for rigorous independent thinking that characterizes genuine scientists rather than competent technicians. His ability to maintain intellectual focus through sustained personal difficulty is, in my experience, rare in researchers of any age, let alone in someone at the beginning of his academic career. I recommend him without reservation. Timothy looked at the screen for a long moment. You had this ready already, before I even came. I've always understood my responsibility to you, I said. Family doesn't end because the adults in it make terrible choices. I needed you to know that through something more concrete than words. He was quiet again. Then, why did you do all of this? The scholarship, the letter, everything. You didn't owe me anything. What happened wasn't your fault. I considered the question as I would have considered any question worth answering carefully. I did it because your mother tried to reduce you to a function, I said. To treat you as leverage rather than as a person who deserved to become something. I did it because your father was weak during a period when you needed him to be strong, and you absorbed consequences you had no part in creating. And I did it because Eleanor, your grandmother, who loved you when you were 4 years old and still carrying the weight of not knowing why your life kept changing, would have wanted someone to be present for you. I chose to be that person. Timothy stood up. He crossed the office and hugged me without ceremony or advance notice, the way people embrace when they're not performing it for anyone, when it's simply the most accurate available expression of something too large for words. Thank you, he said. And you earned the scholarship, I said when he stepped back. I just made sure the structure existed for you to earn it. I submitted the recommendation through the fellowship portal before he left the building. We discussed the program timeline, the lab assignments, the nature of summer research versus coursework. The conversation was practical and ordinary, and felt in its ordinariness like the most significant thing that had happened in some time. When Timothy walked out of the office, I sat for a long while in the afternoon quiet. The Prometheus scheme, the disappearing ink, the demand letters, all of it had been mechanism. This was the point. Not the verdict. Not Tiffany in custody. This, a 17-year-old with a scholarship and a research fellowship, and a grandfather who had made sure those things would exist before any of it became necessary. The trap had worked exactly as designed. What it had caught was the future. I returned now to April 2nd, 2 weeks after the verdict, and more than a year before the afternoon Timothy appeared in my office doorway. The federal courthouse that day had a different quality than it had possessed on March 15th. The verdict day had carried the tension of an unresolved question. Sentencing day carried no questions at all, only the particular weight of outcomes moving through their final procedural channel before becoming permanent. We arrived early. Sarah had driven, which was something she had insisted on when I told her the date, with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who has decided that certain things are not negotiable. Marcus met us on the courthouse steps. Timothy stood beside his father in the April morning light, taller than he had been in January, wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit his shoulders yet, in the way of a young man who has grown faster than his wardrobe. I looked at the four of us assembled on those steps and thought about the birthday party in October, Marcus at the door with his 1.5-second hug, Tiffany performing her small theater for an audience of investors, Timothy already asleep upstairs. What had been fractured then was not fully repaired now. It would not be fully repaired for a long time, perhaps ever. But it was standing. We filed into the courtroom and took our seats in the third row. The proceedings moved with the efficiency of a court that had processed the PSY and pre-sentence documentation, quickly accelerated, Rebecca Walsh had explained, because the federal investigation had already generated over 50 pages of forensic financial analysis, and the court had determined that a standard 90-day report period was unnecessary given the evidentiary comprehensiveness already on record. The prosecution went first, Carol Reeves, the same methodical federal prosecutor from the testimony hearing, presented the sentencing argument without flourish and without hesitation. Your Honor, the evidence establishes a pattern of deliberate multi-year criminal conduct. The defendant was expelled from MIT's graduate program in 2009 for academic fraud. Within 2 years, she had constructed a marriage specifically designed to provide legal access to her supervising professor's assets. Over 14 years, she developed a scheme involving financial manipulation, elder fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and a planned international flight with a co-conspirator. This is not a case of opportunism or temporary poor judgment. It is a case of sustained, premeditated criminal strategy. She paused. The government recommends 5 years federal custody, full restitution, and a permanent bar from financial services employment. The defense offered a brief statement in mitigation, extenuating circumstances, complex personal history, expressions of rehabilitation potential that the courtroom received with the polite quiet reserved for arguments made primarily for the record. Gerald Foote had been a careful attorney throughout. He understood when the evidence had already determined the space available to him. The judge then asked whether the defendant wished to address the court before sentence was imposed. Tiffany stood. She had spent 22 days in federal custody since her remand following the verdict. She looked precisely the same as she had on the day she was brought into custody, same composure, same measured quality in her bearing, same eyes that calculated the room before they communicated anything else. Nothing about incarceration appeared to have loosened whatever mechanism held her together. I did what I believed was necessary, she said. Dr. Grayson ended my academic career in 2009. He acted within his authority, but the consequences were absolute and permanent. What I built in the years after that was a response to those consequences. I don't expect the court to accept that as justification, but I want the record to reflect that I had reasons. I always had reasons. She sat down. The courtroom was entirely silent. Foote did not look at his client. The judge, a woman named Miriam Hatch, who had been on the federal bench for 19 years, and who had, according to Rebecca Walsh, a particular intolerance for financial crimes against elderly victims, reviewed her notes for a moment before she began. Before I impose sentence, I want to make several observations for the record, she said. The defendant's statement articulates a grievance. I accept that the grievance was real to her. What I cannot accept is the methodology she chose in responding to it, a methodology that treated human beings as instruments and placed a man's autonomy, safety, and family in deliberate jeopardy over a period of years. She set down her notes. This case is also notable for what occurred on the other side of it. Dr. Richard Grayson faced a sustained and sophisticated effort to strip him of his legal and financial agency. He did not respond with panic. He did not retaliate impulsively. He documented. He protected the people dependent on him. He constructed legal structures that allowed the conspirators to fully reveal their intentions before any intervention occurred. And he did all of this while maintaining complete compliance with every applicable law. The room was very still. What this court observed is a man who understood the difference between a just outcome and a satisfying one, and chose the former. That discipline in circumstances specifically designed to undermine it is worth noting in the record because it is not common. She returned to the sentencing documents. Tiffany Mitchell Grayson. On 7 counts, including federal wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 criminal conspiracy, under 18 U.S.C. Section 1349 conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, tax evasion, and related charges, this court sentences you to 5 years in federal custody to be served without early release eligibility for the first 36 months. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $180,000 to the victim and a fine of $50,000 to the federal government. Upon completion of your sentence, you will serve 3 years of supervised release and are permanently barred from employment in any financial services capacity. She set down the sentencing sheet. This court is adjourned. When the officers moved to escort Tiffany from the courtroom, she looked at me. It was a direct look, held for approximately 3 seconds, a gaze containing 15 years of accumulated intention arriving at its conclusion. I looked back at her with the attention I would have given any data point at the end of an experiment, noting it, recording it, assigning it its appropriate weight. She was taken out. In the corridor during the recess, my family stood together in the particular quiet that follows the completion of something that has required significant endurance. Sarah's arm was through mine. Timothy stood at Marcus's side. No one said anything for a moment. Carol Reeves approached with the contained satisfaction of a prosecutor at the close of a sound case. "Dr. Grayson," she said, "I want to say that was the most methodically executed self-defense I've seen in 20 years of federal prosecution. Most victims respond to fraud emotionally. You responded with architecture." "Emotion distorts judgment," I said. "Structure protects the people who can't protect themselves." She nodded, once acknowledged Marcus and Sarah, and moved on. Marcus spoke to me as we walked toward the exit. "Thank you," he said, "for protecting Timothy, for not letting me destroy everything Sarah needed, for not walking away from me when you had every right to." I put my hand on his shoulder briefly. "I'm working toward forgiving you," I said. "I won't pretend I'm there yet, but I will always protect the people you should have protected. That has to remain true, regardless of where the forgiveness lands." He nodded. He understood the distinction. We walked through the courthouse lobby and out through the heavy doors into the April sunshine. Timothy fell into step beside me on the courthouse steps. "Is it over now, grandfather?" he asked. I considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "The legal part is over," I said. "The personal part, what your father works through, what you carry from all of this, what healing looks like for your family, that takes considerably longer. But the mechanism is complete. What we do with the space it created is up to us now." He nodded. He reached out and held his father's arm as we descended the steps together. Sarah walked on my other side, and I thought about Eleanor not with grief for the first time in a very long time, but with something quieter. A recognition. She had known what I was capable of when I needed to be. She had also known what I hoped I would never need to become. The distance between those two things, between the professor who had graded papers and made tea and walked past his son's neighborhood without stopping, and the man who had built a shell corporation and watched a federal prosecution complete itself, was the distance I had traveled since October. I had maintained my integrity across that distance. I had made certain of it at every step. That I thought, as we walked through the April morning, was the only thing I would have been unable to repair if I had lost it. Marcus knocked at the study door at 7 in the evening. He had been staying in my guest room for 3 weeks, a temporary arrangement that had extended itself quietly, the way temporary arrangements do when the people involved haven't fully determined what comes next. I had been reviewing SynthMat's pre-IPO documentation. The offering was scheduled for June's, 7 weeks out. The numbers looked the way they had always looked, very large, very clean, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. "Do you have a few minutes?" Marcus asked. "Sit down," I said. He sat in the chair across from my desk, the chair where he had sat in January, empty-handed and destroyed. He looked considerably different now, not healed, not resolved, but upright in a way he hadn't been operating under his own weight, rather than being held up by desperation. "I've been thinking about the estate," he said, "about what happens afterward. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I just want to understand what you want." It was the right question. Not what do I get, but what do you want? I noted the distinction and credited it. "When I die," I said, The primary beneficiaries are Sarah and Timothy. Sarah, through direct inheritance, the house, the laboratory equipment, the 9 active patents remaining in the trust, which she can access fully at 21. The accumulated royalties should reach approximately $2 million by then, depending on licensing activity. I paused. Chati kuntita. Timothy will be supported through the Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund for as long as his education continues, through a doctoral degree if he wants it. And the scholarship fund itself, Marcus asked. When SynthMat completes its IPO in June, I intend to convert my equity stake. The conservative projection is $17.6 million, though the current valuation suggests the final number may be higher into the endowment. Combined with the existing fund assets, the Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund will hold approximately $30 million. That will support materials science students for 100 years. I looked at him directly. Look, that is your mother's legacy, not mine. Mine was the mechanism. Hers was the vision of what it should become. Marcus absorbed this without speaking. As for you, I said, you inherit something that won't appear in any legal document. He looked at me. You inherit the understanding that a family can be rebuilt after it's been broken, I said. Not restored to what it was. That's not possible. And anyone who promises otherwise is lying to you, but rebuilt into something functional, honest, and worth maintaining. That understanding is yours now. It cost a great deal to acquire. I'm giving it to you because you're the only one who can use it. I don't deserve any of it, Marcus said. It was a simple statement, not a performance of humility. He meant it. You don't need to deserve it to accept it, I said. Deserving and accepting are different operations. One is about the past. The other is about what you do from here. Accept what I'm giving you, and then spend the rest of your life making sure Timothy and Sarah understand what the difference costs. He nodded. He didn't say anything, which was the right response. I reached for my phone and called Rebecca Walsh. Rebecca, I said when she answered. I need to update one element of the will. Of course. What do you need? Everything remains as structured with one addition. When Marcus turns 70 years old, he receives a single item, Eleanor's journal from her pregnancy, with him. She wrote in it every day for 9 months. I've had it in the study since she passed. I looked at the photograph on the wall, Eleanor at 52, laughing at something I no longer remembered. I think he should know what she hoped for him. When he's old enough to read it without it destroying him. A brief pause on the line. That's a powerful legacy, Richard, Rebecca said quietly. It's a painful one, I said. But powerful, yes. I ended the call and turned back to Marcus. He had heard the exchange. His face had done something. I didn't have a precise word for, something between grief and recognition. The expression of a man who has just been told that his mother documented her love for him in a book he will not read for another 28 years. That's enough time, I said, answering the question he hadn't asked. You'll have done the work by then, or you won't. Either way, you'll be ready to understand what she wrote. I called Sarah and Timothy into the study. They came without ceremony, Sarah with the directness she always brought to serious moments. Timothy with the slightly formal carefulness of a young man still learning how to inhabit rooms where important things are being decided. I explained the full estate structure to all 3 of them together. Not because it required group discussion, but because they needed to hear it in the same room at the same time, as the same family. When I finished, the study was quiet for a while. Your grandmother established the foundation for everything I'm about to leave behind, I said. She was more perceptive than I was. She saw what people were capable of becoming sometimes, before they did, sometimes before I was willing to. She saw what Tiffany was, and I dismissed it. She saw what Marcus could still become, and I almost let that possibility close. She saw what Sarah was going to be from the time Sarah was 4 years old, and needed someone to be certain of her. Sarah looked at the photograph on the wall. I was the instrument of her vision. I continued. The laboratory, the patents, the structures I built to protect what she cared about, all of it was execution of something she understood before I did. What I'm leaving you is not just assets, it's the continuation of a set of values that she held before either of you was born. That's the inheritance that matters. The rest is just mechanism. Marcus looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he said, I'll try to be worthy of it. Start tomorrow, I said. That's all it requires. Every day you start again. When they left the study, I remained alone with the quiet and the photograph. 31 years of marriage, 6 years of absence, and a study that still held the specific quality of warmth she had given rooms simply by spending time in them. The synth-mat documents were still open on my desk. June would come, and the IPO would complete, and the scholarship fund would become something that would outlast everyone in this house by several generations. 3 patents had expired and given themselves back to the world. 9 remained ticking quietly forward in a trust that bore no one's name but Sarah's. The mechanism was complete. The consequences were in motion. The family fractured, rebuilt, imperfect present had left the room together. That was the only outcome that had ever mattered. The garden in late September had changed since the year before. I had spent the first week of October, 12 months ago, driving past my son's neighborhood and noting the silver car in the driveway. I had spent it reviewing encrypted files in a blue-lit study, calling Margaret Sullivan at midnight, preparing for something I had hoped would never become necessary. The garden had been in the last of its late bloom, then the particular richness of a season not yet willing to acknowledge its end. Now I stood in the same garden on the morning of September 20th, and the quality of the light was identical. The same angle, the same transition in the leaves, the same clarity that comes when the air begins to carry the approaching winter before the calendar agrees to admit it. Eleanor had always said that September was the most honest month, the only one that acknowledged loss and beginning simultaneously without asking you to choose which one to feel. I stood there for a long time not thinking about strategy. Sarah had become a formal research assistant in the materials science laboratory at MIT. The appointment had required a faculty exception. She was a second-year undergraduate, but the university's review committee had noted in their approval documentation that the quality of her preliminary polymer research was commensurate with advanced graduate work. They had not known about the 6 months of forensic documentation or the encrypted USB drives. They had simply read her science, which was sufficient. She was in the laboratory when I arrived at 10:30. She was running a degradation analysis, and she looked up from the spectrometer with the expression of someone whose mind is operating in 2 places simultaneously. "Grandfather," she said, "I've been wanting to ask you something." "Go ahead." She set down her notes. "Why didn't you destroy Tiffany completely? You had the ability to. You had documentation that would have maximized every consequence. You could have pursued civil damages, additional charges, public exposure. You chose not to." I thought about the question for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it deserved to be said precisely. Because pursuing her destruction beyond what justice required would have meant becoming her, I said. Strategic, cold, focused exclusively on the endpoint regardless of what the methodology cost. I decided early that the endpoint was something different from her punishment. It was your future, your safety, the structure that would remain after everything else had resolved. Her consequences were the mechanism. They were never the point. Sarah was quiet. Then she went back to her analysis, which I had learned to recognize as the way she processed things, not by speaking further, but by returning to work. Timothy arrived at the house at 3 in the afternoon, back from his second year of high school, with the particular energy of a young person who has just discovered that he is genuinely interested in something. He had begun asking questions in the laboratory on the evenings he visited, real questions, the kind that indicated genuine engagement rather than performed curiosity. He found me in the garden and sat on the low wall near the back fence. "Grandfather," he said, "do you think I'll turn out like you or like my dad?" The question had the quality of something he had been carrying for a while. I gave it the answer it deserved. "You'll turn out like both of us," I said. "You have your father's capacity to be wounded and to wound others when you're afraid. You have what I hope is some of my capacity to build, rather than simply acquire. Who you become depends entirely on which of those you choose to develop." I looked at him. "That's not a warning. It's the most accurate thing I know about being a Grayson." He nodded. He sat with it. Then he asked if he could come to the laboratory on Saturday, which was the answer I was hoping for. Marcus arrived that evening. He had been building a different legal practice over the past months, smaller, focused on consumer protection and estates work, rather than the corporate mergers that had been his specialty before. He was not yet the attorney he was capable of becoming, but he was moving toward it with the methodical patience of someone who has learned the hard way that there are no shortcuts in the construction of integrity. He knocked at the study door and asked without preamble how I would approach a case in which an elderly client's children were applying pressure about estate management. He asked because he wanted to understand the principle, not because he needed the billable hours. We talked for an hour. It was the first genuinely professional conversation we had ever had. Not father and son negotiating power. Not adversaries managing distance. But two people with different vantage points on the same question working through it together. SynthMat Corporation had completed its public offering in June. My 22% stake had valued at $18.6 million at offering price, slightly above the conservative projection. I had not sold a share. The estate documentation reflected that upon my death, the full equity position would transfer to the Eleanor Walsh Scholarship Fund, increasing the endowment from its current $3 million to approximately $22 million, with growth expected to reach $30 million or beyond over time. Eleanor's name would fund materials science scholarships for a century. Robert Calloway joined us for Sunday dinner on September 22nd. He brought a bottle of wine he described as decent, and that was actually excellent, which was consistent with everything I had observed about him, a man who routinely underrepresented his competence and then delivered beyond the stated expectation. He sat at the kitchen table between Sarah and Timothy and argued amiably with Sarah about polymer crystallization mechanisms, losing the argument gracefully and appearing to enjoy the experience. Marcus sat across from me and said very little which was appropriate. He was still learning how to be present in rooms without managing them. On the evening of September 20th, after everyone had left and the house had settled into its particular quiet, I stood alone in the laboratory for the last time that season. The monitors were off. The samples were secured. Sarah's notes from the week were stacked in the order she always left them, precise, categorical, already pointing toward the next morning's work. I had spent 38 years in laboratories that looked like this, rooms that smelled like controlled environments and careful thought. The work had always been the constant. It remained so. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the wall, the one from 15 years ago before the diagnosis, her laughing at something I no longer remembered. I had looked at this photograph in fear, in grief, in determination, in exhaustion. Tonight I looked at it with something I had not expected to find on the other side of everything that had happened. Gratitude, not for the year, not for the trap or the mechanism or the legal outcome. For her, for the specific quality of her understanding, which had seen what I was capable of and had chosen to remain anyway, and which had known before I did that the people I loved would need me to be more than what I had allowed myself to appear. I turned off the last light and walked through the house. Sarah was reading in the living room. Her notes spread across the coffee table, her shoes off, entirely at home, in a way she had been since she was 4 years old. Timothy was at the kitchen table, doing mathematics with the focused quiet of someone who has discovered that numbers make a reliable kind of sense. Marcus was washing dishes, which he had started doing 3 weeks ago without being asked, and which was in its way the most legible signal he had offered yet that something in him was genuinely changing. I stood in the hallway and watched all 3 of them briefly before they noticed me. This was what the mechanism had been protecting. Not the patents, not the trust instruments, not the financial architecture or the Prometheus documentation or the irrevocable legal structures. This, a kitchen in Cambridge in late September with people I loved inside it, doing the ordinary, irreplaceable work of being a family. The trap had been the most precise thing I ever built. But the structure that mattered, the one that had held through everything, was not something I had constructed. It was something I had simply refused to let be destroyed. I walked through to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat down with my family. The season had turned. The work continued. That was sufficient. If you followed these grandpa stories from the beginning, you already know what I discovered too late. The trap was never the point. The people inside it were. I am not a hero in this family story. I was a father who hid wealth instead of sharing it honestly, a husband who should have listened when Eleanor warned me, and a man who waited too long to be present. Don't be like me. Tell the people you love what you have and what you hope for them before silence forces someone else to fill that space. I believe once with complete conviction that God does not give us broken families by accident. He gives us exactly the circumstances we need to discover whether we are capable of love that costs something. Among all grandpa stories worth telling, the real lesson is never in the strategy. It is in the daily choice to remain human when something harder would be easier. In every family story, the inheritance that matters most is not money. It is the understanding that love is the only structure strong enough to survive being tested. These grandpa stories do not end here. There are others waiting. If something in this family story stayed with you a moment, a choice, a single line, leave it in the comments below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe stories like this deserve to reach more people, subscribing to this channel is how that happens. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If this is not the content for you, find something that fits better, no judgment and no hard feelings.